Treach! Stripper, Striker Baron lashed you to the post. Oh, devil!
Alice, a black woman, is running through a forest and gets frightened by the sounds of animals around her. As she runs, she keeps looking back as if someone is pursuing her. Finally, after running for a while, she comes to a stop because she doesn't know which way to go. After a few seconds of looking around the forest, she screams out of frustration. This is the story of Alice, a black slave, before she ended up running for her life in the forest. The scene changes to the secret wedding of Alice to her groom, Joseph, which takes place in a slave hut and is witnessed by a few slaves like them. The couple holds the wedding in secret because their master who owns them has not permitted them to marry, and it will be terrible if he finds out about the wedding. During the wedding, Moses, the father of Joseph, acts as the priest and leads them to take their vows. Unlike vows that end with people saying "till death do you part," Moses leads them to end their vows by saying "till distance separates them" instead of death. However, these words don't seem strange to Alice and Joseph, who repeat their vows looking into each other's eyes. When it is time for the couple to share a kiss, the sound of a gunshot separates the couple and everyone runs for their lives. Later that night, the slave master Paul, who is a white man along with Aaron, his assistant, visits Joseph at Joseph's hut and calls him outside. When Joseph comes out of the hut, Joseph is surprised to see the big animal that Paul killed when he fired his gun that scared them earlier. As he looks at Paul, who stares at him, Joseph suspects that Paul has found out about the secret wedding, and he has become afraid. So, to ease the tension, Joseph says that he thought Paul caught a rabbit, to which Paul replies by saying that he didn't. When Paul says that he will talk about Joseph's issue the coming Sunday, which confirms Joseph's suspicions. After saying this, Paul asks Joseph to join them to carry the animal home. As Joseph moves toward Paul, it is clear from Joseph's demeanor that he isn't looking forward to Sunday. The next morning, Joseph and other male slaves spend time working on the plantation in front of Paul's house and are monitored by Paul and his mother, Miss Benneth, who sit outside their house. As Paul looks specifically at Joseph, Paul recites verses from the Bible about disobedience and listening to God. On the other hand, Alice, who works as a live-in maid in Paul's house, comes out to serve Paul tea. At the same time, Joseph suddenly stops working and behaves like he is hearing noises before slowly disappearing into the plantation. As soon as Paul sees this, Paul gets up and walks toward the direction of Joseph while loosening his belt on his waist as he walks up. When Paul finds Joseph, he drags Joseph out of the plantation and begins to beat Joseph with his belt. Meanwhile, Alice watches and is unable to help Joseph, who tries to defend himself by saying that he heard the sound of a rabbit and wanted to catch it. Finally, Paul stops beating Joseph, who is seriously injured, and announces that no one should help Joseph. Then, Paul looks at Alice to observe her reaction, and Alice shows no emotions as soon as Paul looks at her. That night, some of the slaves gather at Joseph's house to treat his wounds. Then, Ruth, Joseph's mother, who also works as a live-in maid in Paul's house, comes to check up on her son. Shortly after her arrival, Alice also comes to check on Joseph, but Joseph is not pleased because Alice and Ruth snuck out of Paul's house to see him. As they treat Joseph's wounds, Alice says that the maltreatment cannot keep happening, but Moses says that they have no choice but to bear with it. Also, Ruth supports Moses' point by saying that trying to escape has bad consequences. However, Alice says that since the black people are many, they can fight Paul together, but no one responds to this statement. Then, Moses tries to discourage the topic of escaping the plantation by saying that there are men who hunt escapees at night, to which Alice replies by saying that they can escape in the daytime. Still, Moses insists that it won't work, and Alice is confronted by one of the black men who says she is not wrong for thinking about escaping. At this point, Joseph says he would love to speak with Alice alone, so every other person leaves the room except for Joseph and Alice. As soon as the others leave, Joseph tells Alice that Paul knows about their secret wedding, and Alice is terrified. The following morning, many white people arrive at a church led by Paul because it is Sunday. As the white people are welcome to sit inside the church, the black people, on the other hand, sit outside on the benches. At this particular Sunday service, Paul preaches about fruitfulness and encourages the whites to be fruitful so they can take care of the blacks, whom he refers to as domestic livestock. When the service ends, after everyone has gone except Joseph, who stays back to work, Paul walks up to Joseph as promised nights ago. When Paul gets Joseph's attention, Paul asks Joseph how long it has been since the death of Joseph's first wife. But before Joseph responds, Paul goes on to talk about Joseph getting married again. Paul says that Joseph will get married to another domestic slave donated by a white master so she and Joseph can bear fruit together, as preached that morning. Even though Joseph says he doesn't need a wife, Paul says that Joseph will leave this week to go and procreate with the other slave and can only return once the slave has been confirmed pregnant. At this point, Joseph doesn't respond because he realizes that he doesn't have a choice. Later that evening, Mrs. Bennett meets Paul at Paul's house to inform him that his son Daniel and ex-wife Rachel will be coming back soon. However, Paul shows no enthusiasm and says he doesn't believe Rachel will come back since she has been gone for a long time. Just then, Alice walks in to serve Paul tea, and Paul reminds her that today is Sunday, which means it is time for their lessons. As soon as Alice hears this, she becomes unhappy, and Paul tells her to go and wait in his room. When Alice enters Paul's room, she goes to the shelf to pick up a book that has a white woman as the cover photo. As she admires the woman on the book cover, she sits in front of Paul's mirror and places the book side by side with her face to compare appearances. Just then, Paul walks in on her, which makes her drop the book. Then Paul says that Alice doesn't read enough to understand the book. He continues by saying that he only taught her how to read so she can read to him as a slave. After saying this, Paul asks Alice to sit on the bed, which she is reluctant to do so. Eventually, Alice sits on the bed, and Paul sleeps with her, even though she is uninterested in the act. Meanwhile, that same night, Joseph and Moses spend time talking outside their hut. As they stand outside, Joseph asks Moses if he has ever thought of escaping the plantation, to which Moses replies by saying that he doesn't because it could result in him being killed. Then, Joseph asks if there is any known story of someone successfully escaping the plantation, but Moses tells Joseph a story his own father had told him. Back then, Moses' father had seen someone in a helicopter in the sky, and Moses called the helicopter weird-looking stuff because he doesn't know what it is. As the plane flew past a plantation, a cigarette lighter had dropped, and Moses' father picked it up and buried it somewhere without knowing what it was. When Joseph hears this, he feels hopeful and asks if Moses had seen it too, but Moses said he didn't. However, Moses points out the area where the cigarette lighter was buried, and Joseph decides in his heart to find the lighter. So, the next time the slaves resume outside Paul's residence, Joseph waits for an opportunity to leave and look for the lighter. When Paul leaves the house to pick up Daniel, who's arriving that day, Joseph uses the opportunity to get into the area Moses has pointed out to search for the lighter. Moses, who sees Joseph stop work, asks Joseph to stop, but Joseph is adamant and searches till he finds the lighter. Fortunately, Joseph successfully finds the lighter before anyone notices he stopped working. That same day, when Paul arrives at his residence, he is in the company of his son Daniel, who had gone to school far away. As Paul and Daniel walk past the slaves overhear Paul telling Daniel that a man is rich not by what he owns, but because of what he can do. This statement surprises the slaves as they look at the duo who walk toward the house door. When they arrive at the door, Daniel is welcomed by Alice, who had been standing there waiting to receive him. However, Daniel isn't comfortable with the way Alice welcomes him like a master and doesn't make contact with her face. So when Daniel hears Paul order Alice to prepare food, Daniel snatches his bag from Paul and runs inside the house because he knows Paul is about to order Alice to take his bag inside. Paul is surprised at his behavior because Paul doesn't know why Daniel is behaving this way. Later that night, Joseph sneaks into Alice's room and wakes her up to show her the lighter he found. When Alice asks what the lighter is, Joseph doesn't answer the question, but says that there is more outside the plantation and people like them exist out there too. Then, he says that both of them should leave the plantation soon, but Alice says that Paul has a gun and he will shoot them. Joseph replies to Alice by saying that he will be the one to worry about the gun. Then, when Alice asks what happens if nothing is on the other side, Joseph says he will take his chances. So they agree to escape the next day, and Joseph tells her to wait for a signal to know when to leave. The next morning, Alice is seen reading a book to Paul and Daniel as she waits for Joseph's signal. From where she stands, she can see Joseph and the other slaves working on the plantation. Then, Joseph calls the attention of Aaron, who has a gun, by lying that he has caught a rabbit, and everyone hears this. When Aaron comes too close to Joseph to see the rabbit, Joseph punches Aaron, and the both of them start fighting. On the other hand, Paul sits calmly as they fight, but Alice begins to stutter while reading because she is focused on Joseph. When Alice realizes she won't be able to escape because Paul is sitting outside, she shouts that Joseph should run away. So Joseph runs while Aaron is on the ground, but unfortunately, Aaron gets hold of his gun and shoots at Joseph. Luckily, the bullet only enters Joseph's hand, so Joseph keeps running, but Aaron pursues him. That evening, as Ruth and a worried Alice work in Paul's kitchen, they hear Aaron's voice from outside shouting that he got Joseph. On hearing this, Alice holds back tears and walks outside to know if Joseph is dead or alive. When she gets to the front of the house, she meets Paul talking to Aaron and sees Joseph's lifeless body on the ground. Holding back tears, she turns her back on the sight of the body, and Paul says that he tried to protect her. Then, Paul says that Joseph's body is a picture of what betrayal looks like, and this is a direct warning to Alice not to try escaping too. Later that night, as Paul and Daniel are waiting for their dinner at the table, Paul tries to keep a conversation with Daniel, but Daniel says that he wants to go back. When Alice comes to serve them on the table, Paul asks her to sit and have dinner with them, but Alice doesn't respond to this request. Then, Paul becomes angry and screams at her, demanding that she sits with them, so Alice obeys. When she sits, Paul turns his chair to face Alice and tells Daniel that Alice is a good cook and it will be a shame to lose her. Alice knows that this is another warning to her, but gets triggered as it reminds her of Joseph's death. So she gets up and begins to hit Paul, letting out all her grief and anger. As soon as Alice hits Paul, Daniel runs from the dining room. Eventually, Paul overpowers Alice, who is still angry, so he drags her outside his house. And with the help of Aaron, whom he calls, he ties Alice to a stake. After tying her hands and legs, he leaves her outside in the cold for the entire night. The following morning, when no one is outside yet, Paul wakes Alice by pouring water on her face and also unties her from the stake. Then he hands Alice a glass of water because she is weak, and then starts talking about forgiveness in the Bible because he wants Alice to move on from Joseph's death. However, Alice suddenly smashes the glass on the ground and stabs Paul in the eye, which gives her the opportunity to run away. Without looking back, Alice runs farther and farther into the forest and stops when she doesn't know which way to go. After a few seconds of looking around the forest for a way, Alice screams out of frustration, and her story, after escaping, begins at this point. When Alice regains strength after sitting at the foot of a tree, she starts walking until she comes out on a highway on the other side. Startled by the different environment, Alice walks cluelessly onto the runway and is almost rammed by a truck. As soon as the truck brakes, Alice faints on the road in front of the truck. By the time she regains consciousness, Alice finds herself in the front seat of a car with a man named Frank who is driving. Terrified, she keeps screaming, and Frank asks her to calm down. Eventually, when Alice stops screaming, Alice asks Frank how he got free. Frank is surprised by this question, but thinks Alice is not okay because she hit her head when she fell on the road. Then, starting a conversation with Alice, Frank asks her if she knows she's in Georgia and it's the year 1973. He continues saying jokingly that he wishes they could go back in time to a better year because the current government isn't performing great. However, Frank starts to get concerned when Alice asks if he knows how to go back. As Frank glances at her, surprised by her behavior, Alice brings out the lighter Joseph's grandfather buried because Joseph had given it to her. When Frank sees the lighter, he is interested in it and asks Alice if she is in the Air Force. He then says that the lighter is an old one. Just then, Alice gets nauseated and covers her mouth because she wants to throw up. When Alice finally throws up in the car to Frank's displeasure, Frank drives her to a hospital so she can receive proper care. At the hospital, when Frank parks the truck outside, Alice is startled to see 3 white women pass in front of her, but Frank doesn't notice this. Then, she is reluctant to step out of the truck, but Frank eventually convinces her that she needs a checkup. When they get inside, Frank speaks to the nurse at the reception about Alice and explains that Alice may have amnesia. But when Frank turns to show Alice to the nurse, he doesn't see Alice in the reception area. After searching for a few minutes, Frank finds Alice at the door of a black patient's room, which was left open. Before Frank says anything to her, Alice asks Frank if the patient is free from her owner, and Frank, who is surprised at the question, doesn't respond but leads Alice back to the reception. As Frank goes back to speak with the nurse, Alice sees a magazine on the table in the reception area with a black woman on the cover, and this surprises Alice. Finally, the nurse dismisses Frank and calls for Alice to speak to her. Before Frank leaves the reception, Alice asks for his name and also tells Frank her name when he responds. When Alice walks up to the nurse gives her a form to fill out, and Alice says she cannot write, which surprises the nurse. Luckily, the nurse decides to fill out the form for her and asks Alice basic questions about herself. Then, when the nurse asks Alice her last name, Alice says she doesn't have any. Finally, when the nurse asks Alice her address and Alice says she doesn't know, the nurse decides to send her to the sanatorium for a psych evaluation. Luckily, Frank sees the sanatorium truck outside just before he leaves, and he immediately turns back and heads inside the hospital. After searching for a while, Frank finds Alice in a room waiting to be evaluated. and Frank asks her to follow him outside, saying that the place isn't good for her. As they head outside, Alice says that she is not even sure that Frank isn't a bad guy, so Frank explains that he had a bad experience with the sanatorium. A long time ago, Frank had someone close to him sent to a sanatorium, and the person eventually died there. So with this information, Alice apologizes and follows him back to the truck. As they drive through town, Alice is amazed at the buildings and the people, and when they finally arrive at a big farmland, Alice is surprised to see people farming. Surprised by this, Alice asks Frank whose slaves they are, and although Frank is amazed by the question, he replies that they work for his brother Danny. He also says that the farm is his family business. Just then, Danny comes out to meet Frank and scolds Frank for being 3 hours late for work. As soon as Danny notices Alice, Danny asks Frank who she is. But before Frank can respond, Danny says he hopes Alice is not another friend Frank has brought to give a job. Danny concludes by telling Frank that he wouldn't give anyone a job and asks Frank to finish some reports by the following day. After meeting Danny, Frank leads Alice back to his truck and drives her to his house. On the way there, Frank apologizes to Alice for Danny's behavior by saying that he is embarrassed by what Danny said. Alice doesn't respond to Frank's apology. When they arrive at Frank's house, he asks Alice if she is hungry and opens the freezer to get out some bread. Alice responds by asking if the freezer is Frank's cold closet. At this point, Frank is not surprised by her weird questions. After giving Alice some food, Frank turns on the television, and as Alice stares at the TV, she asks if the people are big people inside the TV. Since Frank is not as surprised as he was earlier, he calmly responds that the people are not inside the television. Later, after eating, Frank leads Alice to the room she will be staying in and gives her the clothes she will need. Then, Frank says goodnight and leaves Alice alone for the evening. The next morning, Frank meets Alice sitting in the table having breakfast, which Alice invites Frank to eat too. After breakfast, Frank plays a song by Stevie Wonder, hoping it will help some of Alice's memories come back, since it is a popular song, but turns the audio off when Alice stares at him blankly. Then, Frank shows Alice the telephone, believing she has used it before to speak to friends. But when Alice picks up the phone and hears it beeping, she drops it immediately out of fear. At this point, Frank believes that Alice must have been injured badly on her head. Finally, before Frank leaves for work, he shows Alice a phone directory on the table. However, Alice gets distracted by a book on the table and asks what the book is about, to which Frank responds by saying it is a book of knowledge. Frank also tells Alice that she can use the directory to contact with anybody by checking for their names. After this, Frank leaves for work, and Alice spends time searching through the directory for Rachel's number. For a while, she calls numbers of people with the Bennett last name, since Alice may still bear Paul's last name, but they are all wrong numbers. Finally, Alice gives up and starts looking around the house, especially taking an interest in books. As she looks around, she sees a beautiful big box on the shelf and sits down to unbox it. Inside the box, Alice finds a newspaper that has Frank's picture on it, with the headline about Frank's mother, who is a black activist and was sent to a sanatorium after severe police brutality. When Alice is done with going through the things in the box, Alice spends the day reading the book she had seen on the breakfast table earlier. As she reads through the book, Alice reads the word slave for the first time and learns its meaning. Then, Alice drops the book and reads some other books she found in the house. In one of the books, Alice reads about a proclamation written on a page that is a picture of a white man pointing a whip at black people working on a plantation as she did. Now, interested in that page of the book, Alice reads about how the proclamation set many slaves free. Eventually, as Alice reads about the work of black activists, Alice finds out that slaves have been free for a long time. When Alice understands what freedom means, Alice breaks down in tears as she repeats out loud that she is free. A few moments later, Alice gains the courage from what she just read and starts dialing numbers hoping to contact with Rachel. This time, when she calls a particular number and connects with someone called Mrs. Bennett, she asks if this Mrs. Bennett was previously married to Paul. Once Rachel, who was Mrs. Bennett, confirms that she was married to Paul, Alice introduces herself, which surprises Rachel, and Rachel asks how Alice is calling her. Alice replies by saying that she is free and tells Rachel that she wants to meet her. So they make an appointment for the next day. Meanwhile, at work, Danny gives Frank a tough time and tells Frank about an immigrant man he claims is stealing from the farm. Although Frank is not pleased with Danny accusing the man, he asks Danny what he should do with the worker, and Danny says Frank should fire the man and his family. However, Frank is not happy with this decision, but cannot disobey Danny. So when Frank arrives at his house that night, Frank is tired from all the stress Danny has put him through. As Frank enters the house, he sees dinner on the table and Alice sitting around the table. Alice then invites Frank to have his dinner, which she served on the table. After taking a bite, Frank tells Alice that they need to figure out what she will do or where she will go. Frank even goes on to suggest taking Alice to a woman's care home to help Alice get her memories back, to which Alice replies by saying that she knows who she is. Alice continues saying that she knows where she came from because she read it in the books. Surprised, Frank asks Alice to tell him who she is, but she doesn't respond directly to the question and instead talks about her whole life being a lie. Finally, Alice tells Frank that she was a slave, but Frank doesn't believe Alice, so he asks her again to tell him who she is. Alice responds by saying that she already told Frank who she was. However, Frank still doesn't believe her and says that they should get someone to help her, to which Alice responds by asking Frank why he can't help her. As soon as she says this, Frank responds out of frustration and says that he is a nobody. After a brief moment of silence, Alice tells Frank about her meeting with Rachel the following day, but does not give him details about the identity of Rachel. Alice tells Frank that Rachel is someone she may know, so Frank offers to drop her at the location of the meeting. So the next morning, Frank gives Alice one of the mother's official clothes, and Alice changes her hairstyle to look like a female black activist she had seen. Together, they set out to the diner, and Frank waits outside while Alice goes in to wait for Rachel. When Rachel shows up at the diner, she brings Daniel with her. At the same time, Frank enters the diner and sits at the table behind Alice, but Alice isn't aware he is there. When they sit down, Daniel tells Alice that he is hungry, which means that Daniel wants her to prepare food for him like she did back home. So Rachel sends him away with her bank card and asks him to go play. As soon as Daniel leaves, Alice tells Rachel that she isn't afraid of her anymore. After hearing this, Rachel replies by saying that Alice never had to be afraid of them. Then, Rachel explains that she and Paul wanted to provide a safe space for their domestic staff, and that means that they had the right to discipline them. Rachel continues by saying that they always thought of the slaves as family, and they were just trying to bring structure to the family by separating duties. After hearing this, Alice becomes angry and says that Rachel and Paul lied to the black people. Before Rachel can respond, Alice talks about freedom, as well as the ill treatment given to the black slaves. Eventually, she threatens Rachel by saying she will hunt Rachel down because of everything that has been done to her people. So Rachel decides to leave. Just as Rachel is about to leave, Rachel tells Alice that freedom is something Alice will never understand, and Alice responds by slapping her. At this point, Frank yells Alice's name, and Alice is shocked to see him inside the diner. At the same time, Rachel quickly leaves the diner with Daniel. Alice tries to follow Rachel, but by the time Alice gets outside to catch up with Rachel, Rachel is driven away. So Alice tells Frank, who followed her, that she needs to go back to the plantation and rescue her people. Then, Alice says that she will need books to know more about freedom and help her people. Determined to help her people, Alice gets many books from libraries and even watches movies about freedom and slavery. At the end of one such movie, as Alice and Frank step outside of the cinema, Alice tells Frank that she will be going back to rescue her people the following day. After hearing this from Alice, Frank tries to discourage her by explaining that even the police will not help a black man, but this doesn't deter Alice. Then, Alice asks Frank why he can't help her, and when Frank doesn't respond, Alice goes on to talk about Frank's memory box that she found while looking around his house. Alice continues saying that Frank had been an activist before, so Alice asks why he stopped fighting for blacks. Turning to face Alice, Frank replies by telling Alice about how he had been an activist until he lost his mother, and the leaders of the fight for freedom stopped fighting for it too. However, Alice doesn't back down and tries to convince Frank by saying that Frank can make a change by himself, to which Frank replies by calling such thought a death sentence in the country. When Alice realizes that Frank won't help, she continues walking till she reaches the car. Before Alice gets in, Alice tells Frank that right can never be wrong, and this last statement seems to change his mind. So Frank asks Alice what her rescue plan is about, but Alice doesn't say anything till they get back to Frank's house. At Frank's house, they develop a plan, and with the help of a map, they trace the location of the plantation. The next morning, Frank goes to meet Danny so he can resign, but as Frank waits for Danny in the office, Frank becomes scared, thinking about the plan. So Frank calls Alice, who is at home waiting, and says he can't do it. Before Frank says anything else, Alice ends the call and goes to the bus terminal by herself. At the same time, Danny arrives at the office, and when Danny notices Frank's demeanor, Danny asks Frank if he is okay. However, Frank only replies with a nod, so Danny demands a verbal response. This makes Frank angry, so Frank stands up to Danny and tells him that a nod is a response. After saying this, Frank walks away from Danny. Back to Alice, who sits at the terminal, waiting to board a bus and go back to the plantation without Frank. As Alice waits for the bus, she sees Frank's truck suddenly stop at the terminal just in front of her. When Alice realizes that Frank has changed his mind, Alice gets into the bus and they drive to the outskirts of the plantation together. When they get there, Alice soaks the plantation on the outside with fuel, while Frank calls the emergency number to report a fire and asks for fire trucks. After Frank drops the call, Alice uses the lighter Joseph gave her to start a fire. Meanwhile, Paul is outside his house having some tea alone. Suddenly, Paul hears strange noises outside, so Paul steps out to find out what is happening. When Paul opens the front door, Paul sees that the plantation is on fire and hears Aaron directing the black people to draw water from the well. However, all the activities stop when everyone sees Frank's truck driving in front of Paul's house. As soon as Paul sees this, he asks the black people to go to the back of the house, but they don't respond. As everyone anticipates who could be inside of the truck, Alice and Frank step down with guns in their hands. Alice goes straight to Paul while Frank points the gun at Aaron. Then, Alice orders Paul to get into the house, which he does after threatening that Alice won't leave this plantation alive. When they get inside the house, Alice leads Paul to his own room and orders him to sit on the bed like he always told her to do. As he sits, Paul asks Alice what she wants, and Alice replies by saying she wants everyone to see the truth. Alice continues by talking about the ill treatment Paul had given to the black people, and then Alice says that it will all end that day. Alice concludes by telling Paul nothing stays hidden forever and that Paul is scared of blacks because they are better than him. After hearing this, Paul tries to defend himself by saying that he gave the blacks a meaningful life. Paul goes on to say that he never told the black people to stay, but he just didn't tell them that they could leave either. Then, Paul asks Alice what she is going to do, to which Alice replies by saying that she will make the last moments of Paul's life hell. After saying this, Alice shoots Paul in his legs and ties Paul with the rope. When Alice drags Paul outside as everyone is watching, and she ties Paul to the stake, just like Paul did to her. Just then, the fire trucks along with the police arrive at the plantation. As Alice stares at Paul, Paul keeps begging for forgiveness. Just then, Alice hugs her people, and someone goes to bring Joseph, who is limping, and presents Joseph to Alice, who is surprised. The couple share a hug, and Joseph says he is happy Alice made it out of the plantation. The movie ends when a firefighter comes to ask Alice her name, and she confidently tells him she is Alice. What if you travel one day and find out there is a world out there more developed than the one you currently live in? What would you do? Do you think there are still black people living somewhere in your country who don't know that times have changed? If you believe there are people like this, where do you suspect they will be in your country? Tell us about it in the comments, and make sure to subscribe and press the bell icon so you won't miss any more exciting movie recaps.